On today's special crossover edition of Locked On Wild and Locked On Florida Panthers, the Wild get an early look at the defending Stanley Cup champions. And if this game is any indication of the recent history between these two teams, we're in for a good one. Let's talk it out.
You're Locked On Panthers, your daily podcast on the Florida Panthers. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is happening, everybody? Welcome into a special crossover edition of Locked On Wild and Locked On Florida Panthers, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. We are your teams each and every day, and we thank you for making both Locked On Florida Panthers and Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube so you don't miss out as we guide you through the NHL season. And if you listen on one of the many audio platforms, we're glad to have you along as well. We don't care where you listen or how you listen. We care that you do listen. So thank you for making Locked On Wild and Locked On Florida Panthers part of your daily routine. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Place your first $5 bet, and you'll get started with $200 in bonus bets, guaranteed. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. On today's crossover episode, Armando Velez of Locked On Florida Panthers joins us as we preview tonight's game between the Minnesota Wild and the Florida Panthers. We'll talk about how the Panthers celebrated their Cup win and how they look to defend their title this season. We'll also get some intel on the early start for the Minnesota Wild and preview tonight's game, which should be a good one between these two teams. My name is Seth Toupal, host of Locked On Wild, joined, as mentioned, by Armando Velez of Locked On Florida Panthers, reigning Stanley Cup champions. And Armando, glad to be able to get an early crossover in here. The Minnesota Wild making the East Coast trip, and always fun to get an early look at the defending Stanley Cup champions.
Yeah, and to think that in their mission to winning the Stanley Cup, it all started last season against the Wild on the road, which the Panthers got goalied by Filip Gustavsson in that first one. And then the second matchup, 4 power play goals, Sergei Bobrovsky gets pulled, and then the Wild scored 2 more after that on Anthony Stolar. So just a wacky season series and just a 180 between the two games. And hey, the Panthers and the Wild, even later on this season, they'll be on the national spotlight when they visit Minnesota, having a nationally televised game later on in the year. So great to be chatting with you on this matchup, and it's great to see a championship in the 30-year history of this Florida Panthers franchise. As very thankful to be in the building to see the Stanley Cup banner being raised to the rafters.
Yeah, that was, I was going to go into that next because you had a chance to cover this team and follow them all the way through, and just so much fun to see, some of the hockey lifers. Like Paul Parise is one that I really think of getting a chance to be rewarded for a really good season start to finish for this Panthers team. And they battled adversity against the Edmonton Oilers. They rallied back to come away with the win. And so we'll talk a little bit more about how the Panthers have kind of built off of last season. But I got to know first, because the Minnesota Wild haven't had a chance to do this yet, who had the most unique or fun Stanley Cup trophy celebration? Because, as is customary, every player on the team gets a day with the cup. Which one stood out to you the most from the Panthers cup celebration all summer long?
Personal biases, because I am also a lacrosse fan. I loved Brandon Montour's day with the cup, where he took it to the Six Nations. But outside of that, I really loved Matthew Tkachuk's celebration with the cup. Able to take it to the Budweiser brewery. There was him pouring it into the mouth of Keith Tkachuk, while in the background, and is also as a golf fan, right in the background, you see the British Open right behind them as they were watching it while celebrating their day with the cup. So that was a pretty awesome for those two to get the day with the cup. And also Alexander Barkov, the fact that he took his day with the cup in Finland, Barkov City, and then the kickflip, not kickflip, but the skateboard over the Stanley Cup with Phil Pritchard kind of like like the look on his face saying, "Please do not make any contact with the Stanley Cup, please." You just saw that look on his face. But also Sam Bennett, the promise of him to his dad, and then the throwback photo of him with Captain Crunch, and then manifesting that and making that real for him. So lots of great celebrations with the Stanley Cup.
Yeah, and that's one of the best parts, is getting a chance, because this is what all NHL players are building towards, is trying to win a Stanley Cup someday, and to be able to hoist the Stanley Cup. And you hit it right on the head, is some of these celebrations are honoring all the work it took to get to this point. One guy that has a ton of Minnesota ties, Kyle Okposo, was a great part of that. That was so much fun to see from here in Minnesota. And I trust that that the Wild will get there at some point. It's one of those things every summer where I just am a little jealous, to say the least.
And for Kyle Okposo, his day with the cup had to be a little bit delayed because of the global outage that was going on that delayed some flights. So that's another thing that was a little bit of a bummer, that he had less time than he originally wanted to. But the fact that he went out with a bang with winning the Stanley Cup, so that was a definite moment for him. That you just see all the hard work for him. And then after 8+ years of not making the postseason, the last time he actually was in the postseason was actually in 2016 with the Islanders, and that goal that John Tavares scored in the Barclays Center to eliminate the Panthers at the time. Dmitry Kulikov was on the ice before he left the Panthers. Kyle Okposo was on the ice. So that was a lot of them all put together in that moment. Were winning the Stanley Cup with the Panthers on that team. So that's another full circle moment for the Panthers Stanley Cup victory.
Yeah, for sure. And the thing about it, though, unfortunately, is quick memory, because you got to get ready for the season to defend it, because every team is going to be trying to prevent you from doing that. And so let's talk a little bit about Florida coming into the year so far. Off to a pretty good start, despite battling some key injuries so far. What has stood out about the early returns for the Florida Panthers so far this season?
Just the way that certain players have been able to step up. I mean, Sam Reinhart, Anton Lundell, Gustav Forsling are three of the guys who definitely are one to highlight for the Panthers, but also for the stretch of being without Barkov, who got injured in the final moments of their second game against the Ottawa Senators, and then having to kind of manage throughout it. I mean, they're 3-1-1 since that happened, and their penalty kill, they haven't given up a single goal since the injury, and their power play is over 30%. I did not have on my bingo card that Sam Bennett would be leading the Panthers in power play goals for the season through 7 games as well, but Matthew Tkachuk gets sick. But he is scheduled to be back on Tuesday if he is cleared after today's practice. So we will know once the Panthers take morning skate tomorrow. Gadjevich had some back spasms that hadn't loosened, so so it's going to be a little bit until he's back with the Panthers. And Barkov is going to be missing another game, as the latest from Paul Maurice is he's going to return when the Panthers do make their trip to the state of New York for their 3 games over there. So that's another thing for the Panthers there. And Tomasz Nosek is scheduled to come back when the Panthers do go to the Global Series. So facing a lot of injuries, but a lot of players have stepped up, and really for the Panthers, it's just really chugging along, be great on special teams, and also the fact that one of their defensemen, Uvis Balinskis, is actually playing forward. They were down a skater in their previous game against the Vegas Golden Knights, and they still controlled play in that. So but it also comes down to whenever you're a champion, and then guys coming into training camp, there's that extra motivation and that extra juice of, this is the Stanley Cup champions you're talking about. This is you got to grind more. You got to grind away if you truly want to impress. So you see great battles like a Patrick Giles coming in. He even though he didn't make the original opening night roster due to the cap and him being on not in his ZLC but waivers exempt, he was able to be that first call for the Panthers in case of an injury. Although he hasn't necessarily gotten on the score sheet, you still see those kind of battles. And also the Panthers are doing this with Carter Verhaeghe not getting a goal so far this season. And Mackie Samoskevich, he's been close, but he's been showing more and more signs of him belonging in the NHL.
Final one before we switch to a little wild discussion. So far, both Sergei Bobrovsky and Spencer Knight have been in game action in the 7 games so far. And, you look at the numbers, but you look at the numbers and you see save percentages under 90%, goals against a little below 3, or in Spencer Knight's case, above 3. Is it just a situation at this point where the goalies are still kind of feeling out the early part of the season, and in Bobrovsky's case, just hasn't really gotten into that rhythm yet to produce some better numbers, or has his production been just fine so far?
I would say Bobrovsky's is just fine. I mean, Spencer Knight did have one bad performance against the Buffalo Sabres. I mean, you look at the gameplay and you just see that there are quite a few that goals that he gave up that didn't even have screens in front of him, and then you're just head scratching a little bit there. But also, the Panthers haven't had a single game this season where they've given up less than 3 goals. But however, there's some context with that. Opening night against the Boston Bruins, they were already up 6-2 before they gave up 2 garbage time goals. When they gave up their third goal against the Boston Bruins on the road in Columbus Blue Jackets, they're already up by 2. And also the third goal against the Ottawa Senators, it was an empty netter at the very end, like I mentioned earlier in the play that Alexander Barkov got hurt. So they although the numbers say more than 3 goals average per game, there is a little bit of that for the Panthers, and just the fact that they've been able to get to multi-goal leads throughout. But hey, their really first game that they really had to just grind and come back, they had a counter punch to the Vegas Golden Knights every single time. It was 1-0, 1-1, and back and forth right before the Panthers got that game winner in overtime by Gus Forsling. The football equivalent to that was the Miami Dolphins in their Week 1 game against the Jacksonville Jaguars. Didn't have a single lead until that game-winning field goal in overtime. So that's another one.
Yeah, I can certainly relate, and it's interesting because you look at the scores and think, oh, this was close, but when you add that context in of, yeah, these goals happened after the outcome was already decided. It's good to know.
Yeah.
That's some elite insider knowledge there, Armando. So good call. We're going to discuss the Minnesota Wild heading into this game, and so I will hop into I always call it the question chair, but I don't know if that makes any sense at all. So we're just going to have Armando ask some Wild-related questions, and I will do my best to provide the Wild insight there. So we'll continue today's crossover edition of Locked On Wild and Locked On Florida Panthers coming up after this.
But first, we got to tell you guys all about FanDuel. And hey, NFL fans, you could start the season with a big return on FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So you get a hunch in the middle of the game. You can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you can place your bets. And if you are interested in placing your bets for the Minnesota Vikings Thursday night football game on the road against the LA Rams, who the Vikings are starting up hot, being 5-1, and have a chance to still win the division and get a home playoff game. Or if you want to put some bets on the Miami Dolphins with Tua Tagovailoa returning to the lineup against the Arizona Cardinals on Sunday, you could do that all at FanDuel. And you could get started with $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place your first $5 bet. And you could do that all at FanDuel.com. And welcome back to this crossover edition of the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast and Locked On Wild. Thank you once again for making the Locked On Florida Panthers podcast and Locked On Wild your first listen of the day here on a Tuesday edition of the show, where it is a frozen frenzy across the NHL here, with the Minnesota Wild and the Florida Panthers being the second game on the docket here. So after we do our post-game shows, we get to enjoy hockey the rest of the night. And unlike last year, this year we do not have any Major League Baseball postseason conflicts this time around. So the NHL got a little bit lucky with them being the premier showcase for the night for this sport. But Seth, I want to discuss more about this matchup and also big picture things. Mike Russo reported that Filip Gustavsson will be starting against the Florida Panthers on Tuesday. Marc-Andre Fleury in this road trip will get a chance to start in Pittsburgh during this. So very excited for him. Also great Halloween costume by Marc-Andre Fleury, by the way.
Yeah. That was incredible.
Absolutely. So Minnesota, one of 3 teams without a regulation loss, which, funny enough, the Panthers will be playing the other team that doesn't have a regulation loss yet in the New York Rangers later this week on Thursday. But ever since really the buyouts of Zach Parise and Ryan Suter, they've been able to really beef out their farm system. They've been able to get players on really reasonable deals in trades. Like, for example, the Fiala trade, bringing in a guy like Brock Faber. Zeev Boyum is being part of the mix, hopefully in the near future. Zeev Boyum, who is actually teammates with Jack Devine in the University of Denver, which Jack Devine is also having another great season. Jesper Wallstedt is coming up. But also, there's also this question on what they're going to do with it, because you got Marco Rossi's contract coming up with the cap freed up. And also, there's that elephant in the room with everything that's going on with the possible extension of Kirill Kaprizov. And this is not I from what I know, this feels like a situation where you have to try to make a push, because you got to try to convince a superstar to want to stay long term. And this kind of feels like the Florida Panthers just a few years ago, right before Alexander Barkov signed his extension. So this is these are really important 2 years, even with the cap constraints that they're having right now. So how are you viewing this from the Wild side of things?
Well, that's exactly right. Is that this is like the dress rehearsal, or this is like opening night of the performances. You have to be absolutely ready to rock to show Kirill Kaprizov, hey, we have a team that is competitive right now. And if we feel like we have areas that we need to improve, we have players in the system that are going to be able to take those spots. Like the one that, has been publicized quite a bit this year, Marc-Andre Fleury, his final year in the NHL. And so after this year, he will be done. Well, you've got Jesper Wallstedt in the system, and he's going to be able to step up and take that spot. Top 6, you're maybe looking at some upgrades there to try to beef up the scoring because Marcus Johansson is going to be a free agent at the end of the year. It's likely that he is just at this point a placeholder, and the Wild will promote from within with either Liam Ogren, who's on the team right now, or Danila Yurov, the mega prospect who is in the KHL right now and scored earlier today to just continue what has been another solid season for him there. Defensively, you talked about Zeev Boyum. The Wild have a ton of other defensive prospects that they're hoping can take that next step. And so this would be my pitch if I were the one that had to try to convince Kirill to stay, is we have a team that right now is playoff caliber. And this season, last year was a mess for the most part because, you have just that awful start. The goaltending just could not get out of their own way to start the year. And the Wild spent the entire rest of the season trying to dig out from that. The battle level has been right where it needs to be so far this season. Filip Gustavsson's been fantastic. And so you're getting the goaltending. You've got really good pieces in your top 6. If the prospects hit and fill those spots, you've got a pretty competitive team around him to where some of my listeners have kind of put together if you want to keep Kirill happy, make the team good enough that you don't need him to do everything, which I think is a really smart way to put this, is you put a competitive team together that can win without him having to do every bit of it. And if he sees that, that's going to likely help sway him to stay. But the Wild will be able to offer more money and more years, so that's one thing. But that's only half the story with players. Is they want to go somewhere they can win. They want to go somewhere that the team around them is good enough to compete. And so it feels like the Wild are kind of in a little transition on the fly mode here right now. If the prospects pan out, I think that's going to be enough to seal the deal.
Yeah, and it's all you're also trying to sell a little bit of hope there, but at the same time, we spoke about this pre-recording about banking points, and that's kind of what the Panthers and the Wild have in common about what they're doing, with the Panthers obviously doing this with their fair share of injuries. But I mean, despite the penalty kill not being at its best right now, I mean, they're scoring on the power play, fifth best at this moment in time. Their 5-on-5 goal differential is +4, so that's a very encouraging sign of what they're doing. So that's another thing about, and the Panthers really showed at 5-on-5 as far as what they can do in a Stanley Cup playoff run, how important that part of the game is, because you're playing a majority of the games at 5-on-5. So that what they're doing as far as that, I mean, you got to be pretty impressed from what's going on, because I mean, you can't necessarily make the playoffs in October, but definitely you could fall behind. I mean, the Colorado Avalanche are currently going through that right now with their fair share of issues. So so far so good for the Wild.
Yeah, and I think the thing, Armando, that really is impressive to me right now is you talked about the penalty kill, and I think it's at 75% right now if the number hasn't changed since I looked. But it's so few attempts compared to where this team has been at over the last few seasons. They're currently third fewest in the league in terms of penalty minutes. And I think they're like 60 penalty minutes clear of Utah, who's in the number 1 spot right now. This has always been a team that takes their fair share of penalties, but so far this season, they haven't, which has been really impressive. And yeah, the numbers for the penalty kill, they need to be upped for sure. But I think the thing that has been really impressive about this start is that the Wild have been able to get out to early leads, and thanks to the goaltending being able to make, John Hines talks about this all the time, to make the key saves, but also to make the saves that you should make every game. Mm-hmm. And Filip Gustavsson, last year, for whatever reason, it seemed like the Wild were always down 1-0. Every game, it's like you blink and they're down 1-0. And this year, Filip Gustavsson has not let in any of those types of goals, which has allowed the Wild to build a lead, to add to it. And as a result, the Wild currently sit 5 games into the season, having not trailed for a second. Yes, they lost 2 games in OT. Well, they lost 1 in OT and 1 in a shootout, but the moment they lost in OT, the clock stopped and the shootout's untimed. So it's something that's fun to say, but at the end of the day, the fact that the Wild have 8 of the first 10 points, I think, is a really, really good start to the season.
Yeah, and you mentioned the PIM for the Wild on the Panthers side of things. They're third in the NHL in PIM, but based on their style of play and also getting baiting other guys into penalties, their PIM differential based on their opponents have more penalty minutes. So that's also goes to show that not only are they getting taking penalties, but they're also drawing them. So also great. Also interesting to see what the Panthers can do as far as doing that. So for against the Minnesota Wild, which we'll discuss more of our game keys in segment number 3.
And we'll get to that right after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild and Locked On Florida Panthers is brought to you by Indeed. We are driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. If you need to hire, you need Indeed. Indeed is your matching and hiring platform with over 350 million global monthly visitors, according to Indeed data, and a matching engine that helps you find quality candidates fast. Plus, listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/lockedon. Just go to Indeed.com/lockedon right now and support our show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. That's Indeed.com/lockedon. Terms and conditions apply. Need to hire? You need Indeed. One final segment of today's crossover edition of Locked On Wild and Locked On Florida Panthers. Once again, we thank you for making both shows your first listen each and every day. And as you mentioned, Armando, for listeners, make sure to check out all the post-game offerings that we both have in store after this one is done, and a full night of hockey ahead after the game is over. But I like the point that you brought up just before the break, because I think it's going to be a really key thing, is for the Minnesota Wild to not lose their tempers because, as we talked about, it's a team that hasn't been penalized a lot yet this year, but they haven't gone up against a team that has the types of agitators that the Florida Panthers do. And I'm not worried about the Wild not being able to match the physicality, because this is why you brought Yakov Trenin in. This is why you have Marcus Foligno on the team. The Wild have Jake Middleton. They've got Zach Bogosian. They've got Jakub Lauko, who isn't afraid to throw hits himself. So I don't worry about being able to match physicality. I worry about, let's say the Wild take a penalty and get frustrated and then end up taking a retaliatory penalty to negate power play opportunities. You've got to keep an even keel in a game like this, especially with how the last couple of matchups between these two teams have gone.
Yeah, and for the Florida Panthers and that with how well they've been doing on their power play, and the crazy thing is, once again, the amount of different personnel that they've had to shift with the man advantage. Now it's the question is, who do you take out in this mix now with Sam Bennett and Anton Lundell being part of the top power play unit for the Panthers, and then Evan Rodriguez has also had a lot of power play time as well for the Panthers. And also 5-on-5 stats, the underlying numbers for Minnesota, it's not just the eye test. The underlying numbers are amazing. Their expected goals are in the top 5. But also that tells me, but also they're in the top 5 of shots against it per game. So it also goes to show what the Minnesota Wild are doing so far in the season on just the allowing the shot quality, the lack thereof for their opponents. And I mean, you think about guys we mentioned Brock Faber earlier, and also bring in a veteran in Zach Bogosian into the mix as well. So even though he's been there for a little bit, so also what they're doing around the goaltenders and not allowing the good shot quality for them. But it's really for the Panthers, the key to this game is to just continue to pepper shots, because I'm looking at the Corsi 4 percentage for the Minnesota Wild, just under 48% for them, while the Panthers, as I refresh Natural Stat Trick right now, they're 53%. So the Panthers, they control a lot of play. They don't necessarily get a lot of they get a lot of shot volume, but a lot of their shots also get blocked. But when their shots get blocked, weird bounces can happen. A lot of rebound opportunities, second chance, which the Panthers are really good at getting. So it really does come down to, for them, getting in those dirty areas. So that's a big key of this one against a team that doesn't really give up a lot.
Yeah, it's been a big focus for the Minnesota Wild so far this season, is just keeping teams from getting in the slot and getting into those face-off circle areas. Now, they have given up some goals in the face-off circles or from the face-off circles, but you look at when they're happening in the games. Columbus had one in the most recent game that the Wild had. There were like 4 minutes left in the third period. And so at that point, it's not a goal that's going to kill you, because you already had a 3-0 lead at that point. When the game matters and when the game is still in hand, the Wild have done a really good job of preventing teams from getting up close to the net. And on extension, on the offensive side, that has been a huge key for the Wild as well, is to just own that area right in front of the net. So that'll be a key battleground for both teams. I think it's going to come down to a lot of which key players, which top line players have the biggest impact in this game. I don't have to tell Panthers listeners too much about Kirill Kaprizov, but this is why you have a guy like that, is to take games like this over, where you look at the roster and you may say, yeah, the Panthers are deeper in their 4 lines and on defense as well, but they don't have Kirill Kaprizov. Like that's why you have a guy like that, is to be able to turn the tide and to even things out. And so the Kaprizov, Zuccarello, Rossi line is going to need to do some heavy lifting in this one. They've been really good over the last few games. Going to need to continue that here in this one to be able to help the Wild get out to an early lead. And hopefully Filip Gustavsson will lock it down from there.
Yeah, and for the Panthers, their top line currently is mostly a two-way line with Anton Lundell and Sam Reinhart, who really draw the defensive assignments and are the guys playing a lot of penalty kill minutes as well. So that's going to be with having the last change and seeing who will be coming on the ice. You're going to see a lot of those matchups, which, despite no Alexander Barkov, I think this is a really, really great challenge for Anton Lundell to see what else he can do in as he continues to grow. The guy's 23 years old, 50 plus playoff games, the most out of his draft class. So that's another thing for Anton Lundell as he continues to just mature in his game.
Yeah, and you talked exactly about how teams should play the Minnesota Wild is by throwing their best defensive line at Kirill Kaprizov and company. This is why ever since, probably February on from last season, the secondary scoring really became a problem in that the second line just did not produce consistently enough. And so it's like a game of chess. Like the Panthers say, okay, Kirill Kaprizov is right over here. We're going to take him out of play. Is the Matt Boldy line going to be able to step up and do the heavy lifting to counter that, to where then Paul Parise has to say, we got two lines now that are playing pretty well tonight. Which one do we try to take out of the equation? That's been a key for this team well into not just last season, but beyond. And so it's all going to depend on if Matt Boldy, Joel Eriksson Ek, and Marcus Johansson can push, can get a goal. If not, I like Florida's ability to try to at least semi-stop Kirill Kaprizov, but if that second line is buzzing and is humming, then we got a good one in store.
Yeah, and also with Matthew Tkachuk being out a week, it's also with an illness. I don't know how much slower his step might be in his first game back. So that's another key player to watch, as that line will get some minutes against the Boldy line. So another thing to look out for.
Joel Eriksson Ek versus Matthew Tkachuk. Who could want any more? It's so fun to get these types of matchups in these games, because you've got a guy in Joel Eriksson Ek who I think a lot of people that follow the game really closely know how good of a player he is, but he just is a name that never gets any sort of national attention. And so getting a chance to go toe-to-toe against a guy like Matthew Tkachuk, that's going to be fun, because Eriksson Ek tends to be a little bit of an agitator. And so, yeah, big time net front. And so that's going to lead to some fun battles. But, you've got Bennett, you've got Reinhart, like take your pick. It's a star-studded lineup. And so there should be no shortage of goals here tonight. Armando, what is your prediction for what happens in this one?
Man. The Panthers haven't lost in regulation at home so far this season. It's so crazy, the banking of points. I'm gonna say the Panthers continue on at least to get one and point in this one. And hey, I'll predict game winner in overtime. I'll say Carter Verhaeghe gets his first goal of the season. How about that?
I like that both of us are just so trained to understand that in these more crucial matchups, just get a point. And that's exactly where I was thinking too, is I think this game goes to OT, and it's going to depend entirely on how some of those guys not named Kirill Kaprizov do. They've done well to start the year. How about a Marco Rossi game winner in OT to give the Wild I'm going to say 3-2. Like, I know both of these offenses have shown the ability to get some goals on the board, but I think we see a nice tight defensive matchup between these two teams, and I'm going to say 3-2 in OT.
Okay, there you go.
We'll see what happens, but of course, listeners, we will both have you covered regardless of the outcome for this one. So make sure to subscribe right now so you don't miss out on any elite coverage from Locked On Florida Panthers and Locked On Wild here for the rest of the season. We got you covered on YouTube. We got you covered on your favorite audio platforms with new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.